Disinformation, like propaganda, it's telling lies, isn't it? But it's telling lies in sophisticated ways that they seem as though they could be true. Because most propaganda, and for that matter, most disinformation, usually contains elements of truth. In fact, the best propaganda and the best disinformation is all true, because then it can't be proven to be false, but it's not the whole truth. You present facts A, B, C, and D, but you neglect to mention anything about facts E, F, G, and H, because if your audience knew about E, F, G, and H, they would reassess and re-evaluate what it means to say A, B, C, and D. That's what the good propagandist does.
Escaped Sapiens.
How is the balance of global power shifting with the development of science and technology? In this episode of the podcast, I speak with Professor Oliver Boyd-Barrett from Bowling Green State University. Oliver is an expert in international communications, the media, news, war, and terrorism. In this two-part episode, we discuss the shifting science of propaganda. How does social media enable distraction and polarization? How does misinformation spread? Do bot farms and troll armies democratize propaganda? Does cyber warfare level the balance of global power? Or do the same old forces continue to hold sway? This one's pretty intense. I hope you enjoy. Oliver Boyd-Barrett, welcome on the podcast.
Thank you.
Media propaganda is an enormous topic, and really there are almost infinite entry points into the discussion. But since you've had a recent focus in Russia and so Russiagate and the Ukraine crisis, I thought it might be a good idea to start there with some questions, and then we can branch out more generally into the further discussion.
Absolutely.
So, in the West, Russia and Putin are sort of seen, often spoken about in some sense as boogeymen. And during the Trump presidency, essentially the whole way through, there was discussion of interference in the election, the 2016 election. And whether or not there was any sort of fiddling or meddling from the Russian side, I want to get some senses towards the motivations. So what are the reasons that Russia may have wanted Trump to win the presidency as opposed to Hillary?
Yes, there were some reasons why Russia would have wanted Trump over Hillary Clinton. The main reason being that Trump, in his campaign, but before his campaign, had indicated his interest. There are many things that I can say about Trump that are positive. But one of the things that I can say about him is that in the period leading up to the 2016 election, he did sound remarkably sensible and balanced in his view of Russia. Like any good businessman, I suppose, he had the idea that it's actually quite a good idea to keep relations open with as many people as possible, because then you can do business and there's more opportunity for earning profit, maybe to the mutual advantage of the different parties. This seemed to me to be eminently sensible, and furthermore, it had a very significant political implication that would have, in my view, would have suited American foreign policy interests. Namely, it would have likely ensured that there would remain a barrier, a gap between Russia and China. So long as the Euro-Asian continent is divided between two competitive powers, namely Russia and China, so much the better for the United States, because then the United States is in a stronger position to pick and choose, or to decide, well, we will ally with Russia, and in that way we will contain China. Because Russia is a far smaller economy. It's a big country geographically. It has that going for it. But its population is very, very modest, 150 million. Its GDP is extremely modest. Its defense expenditure is actually very modest. All of these things would have actually made Russia quite a good ally for the United States. Not to mention the fact that Trump and many of his colleagues had a surprisingly strong network of affiliations and contacts Russian speakers. Now, I'm not saying that all of those were particularly desirable, but it did indicate that they had a very strong platform from which they could begin to build an interesting relationship with Russia that would have broken the mold that has been set over the last decade or so between the United States and Russia. So all of this, I felt, was a positive. It's about the only positive thing I have to say about Donald Trump, but it's kind of an important positive because it removes some of the threat of nuclear war.
Mm-hmm.
If Russia and the United States are actually talking to one another, having business dealings with one another, actually care positively about one another, the chances of a nuclear war, whether by accident or by design, are immensely less. And that, to my mind, is a really, really good thing.
So,
So,
in your
yes.
view, was this a wasted opportunity then to focus on this particular influence on the elections?
What was a wasted opportunity was the Democratic Party decision to to critique Trump for his supposed friendly inclinations towards Russia. Why? What set them on that path? Well, to my mind, there's very little doubt any longer. Not only as a result of my work, but as a result of the work that I have seen that I hope will very soon be published by a Russia expert in the United Kingdom, Professor Sakwa at the University of Canterbury. He's about to produce, I very much hope, because a quick aside, the publishing industry now, the academic publishing industry, is itself, I don't have any direct evidence for this, so but I have to speculate, and I do speculate that the publishing industry, particularly in Great Britain, but possibly here in the United States, is ever more sensitive to and compliant with the wishes of the deep state. And
Mm-hmm.
so whether we're going to see this stunningly impactful work from Richard Sakwa, I don't know. I very much hope so. But I think he's more or less, in my view, he's more or less concluded the case. And what is the case? The case that the Democrats wanted us to believe was that the Russian intelligence, both arms of Russian and major Russian intelligence, had hacked the DNC and the DCC emails, or computers, I should say, their servers. And according to the Democratic Party, this was a dastardly thing. This was a horrible thing. It just showed that how brutal and how wicked the Russians were. And then, of course, they leapt on, or they produced evidence that not only had the Russians hacked the DNC and DCC servers and computers, which, by the way, I don't think they did. Let's go. We must get back to that at some point in the next few minutes or hour or so. But also that the Russians, through the internet, through the services of the Internet Research Agency based in St. Petersburg, had malignly set about trying to influence the American electorate against the candidature of Democratic Hillary Clinton. So these are the two major counts that the Democratic Party used in order to make the claim, or to help support the claim, that that Trump was, not only was he the preferred candidate of Russia, but he was more or less in bed with Russia, and this was very, very serious, according to the Democrats. This was very, very serious from the point of view of American national security. So let's briefly retrace the three major points here. One, the claim that the Russians had hacked the DNC and DCCC servers. The claim, secondly, that not only did the Russians set about influencing the American electorate through all kinds of shenanigans on the internet, bots and trolls and deepfakes and all the rest of it. But not only did they try, which in my view itself is doubtful, but they were very effective at doing this. And they accounted for the failure of Hillary Clinton to secure the presidency of the United States.
Could I pause you for a second and ask?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Could I ask, what were the reasons why the Democratic, was that for foreign policy reasons, or was that an internal motivation, primarily?
Well, the one thing that the emails from the DNC, whether they were hacked or whether they were leaked, that's another aspect of this that we must get to. Whether or not they were hacked or they were leaked, some of those emails got out, of course. Well, many hundreds, if not thousands, got out and were published by WikiLeaks, which brings the whole role of Julian Assange into the picture, much to the delight of the Democrats, who couldn't wait to swipe and smear Julian Assange one more time.
Mm-hmm.
Poor guy is now languishing, of course, still in jail in prison in Great Britain, awaiting justice, which he will never receive. And what these emails showed, and this we know this is real because it led to the resignation within days of the chairwoman of the DNC. They revealed that rather than being an impartial administrator of Democratic Party interests as between the two major candidates for nomination for the Democratic candidate between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, that the DNC had intervened to make sure that Hillary Clinton would win the nomination. At the end of, we're talking about July 2016, at the end of July 2016, at the time of the Democratic Party convention. And not only that, but also that Hillary Clinton, in speeches for which she was paid enormous amounts of money, of course, in speeches to Wall Street and the big corporations, was saying things much closer to their interests and to what they wanted to hear from her than she was actually telling the American electorate. So there were these two immensely embarrassing revelations as a result of the publication of these emails. And this was just within a couple of weeks or so of the Democratic Party convention, which did indeed nominate Hillary Clinton. The most convincing narrative, and this is the narrative that Sakwa himself supports. These are all revelations that were not available, unfortunately, at the time that I wrote my book a year or so earlier. But Clinton and her advisors came up with this fantastic story about how the Russians had hacked their emails and had sent them to Julian Assange through DC Leaks and one other site that was said to be cutouts. The expression they use, cutouts for Russian intelligence. And the mainstream press, which you would think would be more intelligent, and they actually are intelligent. They know precisely what it is that they are doing, I believe. But the mainstream press allowed itself to be totally distracted by the Russian narrative and to totally forget that Hillary Clinton, in essence, or rather the DNC on her behalf,
Had done exactly the same thing.
Was fraudulent. Yes.
So could I ask a question then?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. Could I take a step back? So you mentioned that you don't think that Russia actually did this, or at least if they did it, it sounds as though you don't think what happened was effective.
Okay. So there are. Let's go. I think we need to kind of keep as separate entities for the moment. One is the whole hacking narrative. That is separate from Russia interfered in the election through the internet. That's a separate cluster of issues there. But if we just look at the alleged Russian hacking, there are a number of problems with that main story. The, the problem that I looked at when I wrote my book on Russiagate and propaganda was the conclusion that a body called the Veterans, I beg your pardon, VIPs, Veterans for. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the exact.
That's fine.
The acronym is VIPs, and it's something about intelligence veterans for.
I can flash that up on screen.
Yeah,
It's no
yes,
worry.
please. Thank you so much. VIPs, and this little group of intelligence veterans includes some incredibly experienced people, and one of them is Ray McGovern, who was a former CIA employee, and he was in charge of the Moscow desk. So he's a Russian expert, amongst other things. There's also William Binney, who had a very, very senior role in the NSA. Until a decade or so ago, and there are other equally eminent intelligence veterans who are part of this particular group. They, if you like, they ran tests on the basis of the claims that were emanating from the Democratic Party or from CrowdStrike, which was employed by the Democratic Party to investigate the so-called Russian hack. And the conclusion they came to was that the speed of the download was far too fast. The speed with which these files were transmitted elsewhere was far too fast, and that the only credible way in which this process occurred was through a leak. Some internal person using flash drives or the equivalent. I'm talking very much in layman's language, which VIPS does not do, but this is the sense that I make of it. And their conclusion was that it was a leak, and this conclusion was also supported by two surprisingly. Well, one perhaps not quite so surprising. So Julian Assange totally rubbished the idea that he had received anything from DC leaks or from or directly from Russian intelligence. Julian Assange also seemed to take a particular interest in the. We need to be careful here because this is litigated passionately by the man's family, but there was a fairly young employee at working for the DNC who, shortly after this period, was murdered, and in Washington D.C., I believe, nothing was stolen, and it's difficult to work out what exactly it is that the FBI or law enforcement generally actually, what action did they take? What depth of investigation did they take in this rather upsetting crime? But Julian Assange took a particular interest. He seemed to take a particular interest in this event because he offered a reward for information about this murder. So Julian Assange totally denies that it was a hack, or at least in any way he denies that he benefited in any way from any such hack, indicating therefore that as far as he's concerned, he got these files from other sources.
Mm-hmm.
There's another gentleman who's also
Which could have been downloaded locally.
exactly, and taken physically in some way to Julian Assange. Now, there's a very, to my mind, very strange claim, but by a gentleman who is very much in the public eye. And I do talk about this in my book, and his name is Craig Murray. And Craig Murray was a former British diplomat working in Central Asia, one of the Central Asian republics. He resigned in protest against the British government's continuing positive relations with a regime that Craig Murray deemed to not merely to be dictatorial, but to be engaged in the most horrific murders and torture of people who were suspected of supporting radical Islamist movements. So Craig Murray is in the news again. He's constantly in the news because he's an avid blogger. But the main thing I want to bring to your attention now is that not long after these events, back in 2016, Craig Murray said that he himself knew the person who was responsible for physically transferring the files from whatever device the files were leaked onto,
but gave no further information,
and brought them to Julian Assange. So that claim, I don't know whether Craig Murray has addressed this issue recently, but he has made that claim in the past. He hasn't repudiated that claim, and it does seem to me a very odd claim to make. If you're simply making it up.
Is the link you're trying to draw that this murdered gentleman may have been this individual who had done the transfer?
No, I think we shouldn't go down there. We should note it in passing. We should note that the man's family has litigated the kind of suggestions that have been made, and that there's no need for us to try to unpack it, because we can't. We don't have the evidence. We don't have the information. But what we do know is that there are a number of people, for different reasons. The most important of these reasons, however, are scientific reasons, are empirical reasons, the reasons that VIPS has come up with, which are published and which have been critiqued by reputable cyber security experts and found to be credible and found to be likely true. The VIPS claim that there wasn't a hack, it was a leak. So that's one side of it that I was able to at least to address in my book on Russiagate and propaganda, which actually came out. I'm thinking the date of publication is 2020, although it actually did appear in 2019. So it's already, to some extent, not wrong, but out of date. I could have gotten much better evidence had I published it, say, this year. And that's what Sakwa has done, by the way. When his book does appear, please do look out for it. Now, the other major aspect here is the role of CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike is a supposedly private cybersecurity company that was employed by the Democratic Party, by the DNC, to investigate the alleged hack of spring and summer 2016. And the single most important thing to know about CrowdStrike is it is CrowdStrike that made the claim towards the end of it doesn't matter in this conversation. It doesn't matter too much the precise details. I'm trying to recall when exactly CrowdStrike made its claim, but it's before the Democratic Party convention at the end of July 2016. several weeks in advance of that, and they make the claim that that it's Russian. It's got all the hallmarks. It's got all the fingerprints of the GRU, which is the military Russian military intelligence. And
how can they show that? What are the signs that would indicate that it's Russian intelligence as opposed to someone domestic or someone else?
I think we can safely say that the signs are all the signs that the hacker, or rather the alleged hacker, if this hacker has got any competence at all the signs are the signs that the hacker wanted the investigators to find. Mm-hmm. Absurd Russian fingerprints, such as the name of the founding father of Soviet intelligence, and just other unbelievable nonsense.
But this also happens in other cases. So, for example, when these poisonings of Russian spies, this sort of thing, often are done in ways that could only be traced back to Russia, right? So you could raise the argument that this is not unusual behavior. Is that the case, or?
Okay, we do need to talk about Russian poisonings. But
sorry, this is a bit out of left field.
No. This is fine. But let's just stick with the hacking just for a moment longer,
sure.
Because the important thing about CrowdStrike, we found out when CrowdStrike was actually forced to present its evidence or to talk in public to anyone beyond the DNC through congressional investigation committees, of which there were many. CrowdStrike, as Ray McGovern, who writes about these issues quite regularly, and I recommend that you look up some of his recent emails. CrowdStrike had the founder and CEO of CrowdStrike had to confess, well, no, we don't actually have any hard evidence. We don't have any hard evidence, and that is still the position of CrowdStrike. Furthermore, CrowdStrike never actually produced its final report on its investigation. Why? Or rather, it never produced its final report for the FBI. And the FBI forgot to ask for it. There's a very curious book. I intended to have it in front of me, and I can probably go get it actually in a second.
Again, I can bring that up on the screen.
Okay, but I'm forgetting the title of it. So let me just. Yes, load. Here's the title of it. I need to be careful here because this is a self-published book by a gentleman about which I know and can find nothing of any substance. But his book is amazing, in my opinion, and it's called Loading Guccifer 2.
Okay.
I gather that he's a Brit. He seems to know a great deal about hacking and cybersecurity issues, and he goes into considerable detail about CrowdStrike. The implication is that the entire thing is a hoax that's cooked up, and I'm saying I underline the word implication. I'm not making a claim to fact here. And in fact, I need to be a little bit more nuanced even and say this is an implication that's based on my inference of what I have read in other places, but I've been particularly impressed by the account that is offered by David Blake in this book, Loading Guccifer 2. Guccifer 2, by the way, was one of these, along with DC Leaks, was one of these supposed Russian intelligence cutouts that allegedly received the emails from the DNC. And so it turns out that CrowdStrike it was a private company and still is, by the way. It remains a very active company. It is, and it's privately owned. But it had already done quite a lot of work for the FBI.
Mm-hmm.
Because one has to ask, and many people have asked, well, why didn't the FBI do its investigation, direct investigation? Why did the FBI rely on a relatively small private cybersecurity company? Why did the FBI, in its own investigations of Russiagate, which started in the middle of 2016, by the way, why did the FBI rely on the findings of a small private cybersecurity company and never, so far as anyone can tell, never directly investigated the DNC servers? So the FBI appears to have taken hook, line, and sinker the narrative that CrowdStrike had to tell them. Also, by the way, apparently the Mueller report did the same.
So that was what I was about to ask you. So the result of the Mueller report was the finding that in fact there was some sort of that Russia had indeed been interfering. There was a link found.
Yeah. Yes. Mueller had all kinds of assertive conclusions that had nothing to do with the original reason why Mueller was set up. Mueller was set up to find out what was there direct collaboration between Russia and the Trump campaign, and he's forced to conclude, well, actually, he doesn't even like the word collusion because there are legal problems with the word collusion. But was there coordination? Was there collaboration? Was there some kind of partnership? And ultimately, on most counts, he concludes, well, I can't really find the evidence, really. But yes, there was this organization, Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, that looks like it did all kinds of dreadful things. And Mueller indicts a number of Russians, and he doesn't indict anyone who's actually an American citizen, other than one or two poor unfortunate people who get indicted for crimes that had little or absolutely nothing to do with Russiagate. Mueller behaves as though he knew he had to find something and accuse somebody of something, even though whatever that something is or whatever that somebody is, it doesn't really essentially deal with the very essence of the charge that there was a direct partnership between the Trump campaign and Russia. So let me just quickly try to go back and then leave. So we go back to CrowdStrike. To say the least, there is something incredibly odd about this company and about its role as apparently the golden source of information that the Russian intelligence hacked the DNC emails, and CrowdStrike itself admits, well, nah, we don't actually have the hard evidence. And as David Blake says, it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to prove hacking. Mm-hmm. Everything that the investigators of a hacking claim find is what the hacker left deliberately and intentionally to be found. And once you accept that, and also once you accept the findings of the Snowden revelations some years before, that US intelligence has the means to plant, has the means of false flag hacks, that is to say, can easily create a situation where you investigate a hack and you attribute that hack to a certain source, and that attribution is itself a falsification, is itself a fabrication. So we from Snowden, we knew that the possibility of actually proving that some specific individual, let alone a country, some specific, because the presumption always is, oh well, the hacker, he's got some Cyric symbols here, or the hacker does or says something that suggests Russia. That the assumption always, oh, therefore he's close to Putin. or he works for the GRU, but no one really knows this for sure.
So one thing that I want to get a handle on is, let's imagine for the time being that this really did happen, that there really was some foreign. Let's imagine this is a scenario that was real. I want to understand quantitatively what impact that could have had on the election. So even in the case where this did unfold, would the impact have been enough to sway an election? Would it have been enough to fit the objective of the narrative? Or is it? Yeah, I guess that's a pretty clear question.
Yeah, no, thank you. Excuse me. Because, of course, this is speculative, one can't assert anything too strongly. If the American electorate had never discovered that Hillary Clinton, that her ascension to the president, to being the Democratic Party presidential candidate, if the American electorate had discovered that, well, the DNC appears to have cooked the books to make it more likely that Hillary Clinton and not Bernie Sanders would be the candidate, might that have changed things? And my feeling is it could have done, because there are some indications that many, and I say many, but I've got no idea what the proportion is, but there was certainly a subset of of Trump supporters who, when Bernie Sanders was still a live, possible, likely candidate, would have supported Bernie Sanders. They were looking for change. They were looking for real change that seemed to be seriously interested in the welfare of the average working man and woman. Bernie Sanders offered that, and they were interested in that offer. But now they learn, oh, well, it looks like the DNC have decided they're going to push whatever happens. We end up with Hillary Clinton. And this subset of Trump supporters, of course, deeply disappointed, may therefore have switched their allegiance not to Hillary Clinton from Bernie Sanders, but to Donald Trump, who at the very least was saying some very anti-establishment things. Of course, because it's speculative, it's very difficult one has to be very careful about being overly assertive about this kind of thing. But I think there was a chance. I think there was a chance that had the American electorate let me. I need to sort of slightly rephrase the way that I'm telling this this narrative. So the so-called the hacked emails seemed to show, and this was supported by the fact that the chairwoman of the DNC resigned within days of this revelation. They seemed to show that the DNC was acting not neutrally between the two candidates for the presidential candidacy for the Democratic Party, but was actually favoring Hillary Clinton. And had that never been discovered, then it may be that the American electorate would have continued to believe, if they believed it at all, that Hillary Clinton was indeed the choice of Democratic voters across the United States, and therefore one needs to respect that and to vote for her. The fact that they discovered that actually Hillary Clinton was perhaps a bit of a crook, or the DNC was acting in a crooked way, that might have led some potential Democratic voters to say, to hell with this. We're not supporting the DNC anymore. We will switch our allegiance to this guy, Donald Trump, because at least Donald Trump is saying stuff that's anti-establishment. At least Donald Trump is saying stuff that kind of appeals to the gut instincts of the average American working man and working woman. Just as Bernie Sanders had spoken to their interests, although in a much more intelligent and logical way. Trump did so in a totally irrational and, as far as I'm concerned, a totally unbelievable way, but less informed voters might have decided, Trump, we can't have Bernie Sanders, okay, well, we'll go to the other extreme. Anything other than this dreadful possibility of a return of orthodox establishment, liberal East Coast establishment, continuation of the same possibility. That's what they were. So it could have made a difference. I'm much less inclined to believe that let's assume that the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg was working for Vladimir Putin. Putin was there giving them orders every day. I want you to do this, I want you to do that. And let's suppose that the Internet Research Agency was doing everything it possibly could to persuade the American electorate that Trump Trump was basically a good guy and Hillary Clinton was evil. Were they in any way? Would they have been successful? And my conclusion to that is no, they wouldn't have been. Because whatever was going on in the world of the internet, the number of emails that you can in some form or another trace back to the IRA is an infinitesimally small percentage of the entire traffic on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, and all the other ones. It's infinitesimally small when you compare it to the total size of social media traffic.
That's a question that I really wanted to jump in when we start talking about these troll farms and bot armies. I wanted to get some some understanding of how big does your bot army need to be to actually make an impact on social media. But before we go there, I wanted to just finish up on this first topic with the question, what impact did this have on US and Russia relations? The fact that Russiagate was in the news and the news cycle was just continuously following this one story.
The first impact that it had on Russia-US relations is that it totally undermined Trump's capability of doing anything on Russia. From day one, he was besieged by a press hysteria and a Democratic Party hysteria and an intelligence community hysteria that was suggesting not only was he friendly to Russia, he was actually possibly working for the Russians. He was a Manchurian candidate. This is what the Steele report was claiming. These were the allegations that were being repeated ad nauseum throughout the first months of the Trump candidacy. So Trump was totally incapacitated. He couldn't do anything vis-a-vis Russia that could remotely be seen to support these. Well, I have no hesitation now in saying totally absurd fantasies about Trump being in any form or another being a Russian agent. So he had to just do exactly what the intelligence community wanted him to do, exactly what the Democratic Party would have done had they been in power. He kept making things more difficult for Russia. He was sanctioning them here, there, and everywhere. He was fighting them in Syria. He was saying more and more anti-Russian things just to get this incubus of false, fake allegations off his back, so that he could actually start being, in his mind, a real president. So it had a very, very damaging effect from the point of view of both sides. Russia just, I think, recoiled in horror when it saw what was going on, and I think gave up on the possibility of a cordial relationship with the United States from then on, and they. The outcome has to be that Russia has totally lost trust in the entire U.S. political system, and in the light also of the aggressiveness of NATO on the borders of Russia, in the light of the aftermath of the US-supported coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2013, 2014. All of these things, I think, now make it extremely difficult to see light at the end of the tunnel, because the Republican Party can't afford to be seen to be in any remote sense favorable to Russia, and the Democratic Party, which is more interestingly, is far more the mouthpiece for the intelligence community, the military-industrial complex, for want of a better term, than the Republican Party. The Democratic Party is far more in bed with that incubus than is the Republican Party. So the Russians, quite correctly, I think, have realized that since Trump was tearing up what remained of our global security through our treaties concerning nuclear weapons, there was nothing for it but to commit much, much more money towards advancing and improving their weapons system. And they did that to an astonishing degree, actually, in the development of hypersonic nuclear missiles and warheads. Some experts will make the claim that in terms of sophistication, Russia is actually ahead. America is still trying desperately to catch up with Russia in the development of hypersonic weapons, which are these weapons that they move around. They don't have a single linear trajectory. They move around. It's very, very difficult to knock these things out, and therefore they're far more dangerous than previous generations of nuclear weaponry. So,
and
yes.
this came out as a development because Russia felt that it had to spend more on its defense.
Yes.
But let me jump on something that you mentioned, because I'm not quite sure I followed it. So you said that this revolution in, if I'm understanding correctly, in Ukraine, are you suggesting that was somehow orchestrated on the US end? Or did I mishear what you were saying?
No. So now we get into, when you first, I don't know to what extent, Shane, or your listeners, have followed this trajectory of these what we call the regime change narratives. Is a bit of a shock when you first hit it, but then you realize, well, actually, that's what nations have been doing, since the beginning of time, or at least since the beginning of nations. They've been trying to influence the political developments in other countries that matter to them, whether as potential enemies or as potential friends. If you control the territory that's next door to mine, and I see that whatever political group is on the ascendant, and that political group doesn't like me or doesn't like my nation, I'm going to do my damnedest to influence your political process to make sure that it doesn't happen. This has been going. This is the game of international relations since the beginning, as I say, since the beginning of nations. So there's nothing terribly surprising about regime change, other than the discovery that it plays a very, very big part in modern in modern politics. It was part of the relationship between the United States and the first post-Soviet leader in Russia, Boris Yeltsin, in the 1990s. So Yeltsin reached out most inadvisedly to American financiers to help him make this, to complete the transition that Gorbachev had already started from a planned economy, or a control economy, as economists called it, to a capitalist economy. Gorbachev foolishly, I mean, many things admirable about Gorbachev, but I think the word foolish is the best word. Gorbachev foolishly believed this could be done. This could be effected in 100 days. Well, that was total rubbish. And so the transition to capitalism had hardly begun, even under Yeltsin. But Americans made sure that Yeltsin would develop Russia according to a model of America of capitalism that would suit American interests best. There's no doubt that that the United States played a very heavy hand to secure the re-election of Boris Yeltsin. I don't remember which year it is. I think we're talking about the mid-1990s, because Yeltsin comes to the end of his era in 1999, which is when Vladimir Putin takes over. Now, so this should
Could I ask, when you say they played a heavy hand in that election, by what means?
We're getting a very good handle on this, but it's principally through pouring money into dissident organizations or into political groups that will support whatever it is that you want, and you devote whatever expertise in electioneering shenanigans that you have learned from your own system. You export those to the country that you're trying to influence, and you pour huge amounts of money into this effort, in effect buying votes. But of course, you're also at the same time, you are trying to influence people ideologically. And this is done through organizations like the NED, which is the National Endowment for Democracy, which plays a central role in regime change operations. The NED, by the way, as is well recognized, is simply took off where the CIA left off. A large part of the work that the CIA used to do back in the peak Cold War years was I won't say privatized, but because not to some extent it is privatized, but it was also sloughed off to new state organizations like the NED, whose purpose is to achieve US foreign policy objectives overseas, and where necessary, and it usually is necessary, to do so using means that are non-transparent, to put it at its most polite. So
does this sort of playing around have echoes in the longevity of Putin's presidency at all? I mean, is there some influence there that has led to what we currently see politically?
Well, I think Boris Yeltsin was a tragic joke for the post-Soviet Russia. I'm trying to keep to figures that are credible. Millions of people in this period lost their livelihoods, they lost their homes. Millions of people died before their times in the 1990s. Post-Soviet Russia was a basket case under a man who couldn't hold his drink, Boris Yeltsin, and who is also a plaything for Western interests and Western pressure groups and Western financial activities or influences. And Lenin is more, I think, the model for Vladimir Putin, in the sense that He's an ideologue. He actually believes in the possibility of a sovereign Russian state that is strong, that exerts worldwide influence, that acts judiciously and wisely, that applies rationality to the problems that it sees and it confronts, and also tries to achieve a balance of power between the very wealthy, the so-called oligarchs, and other aspects of the political system. Unlike in the United States, where the oligarchs have free reign pretty much to do what they want. And the oligarchs are free to kind of buy the political system that they want. Like the Koch brothers, for example, and their evil influence on denying climate change. I'm talking about the United States now. So the thing about Putin is he's actually managed to control the oligarch class. He's shown that he's not going to put up with this nonsense. These guys who think they can buy the political system. And if he has to, he'll put them in jail. And he'll let them rot in jail.
I guess what I was trying to get at was, let's say, for example, that America or Western powers had interfered in Russian elections. That's like, I'm wondering if that would have produced a defense mechanism against, the result of which is someone who can stay in power for 3 or 4 election cycles.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think if we're trying to explain the durability of Vladimir Putin, I don't think it has much to do with a kind of popular reaction, if you will, or even an elite reaction to the possibility of U.S. There's no doubt that the United States, is constantly trying to interfere in Russia, because the US and NATO elites, I think many of them firmly believe that Russia is weak, and definitely it does have some very worrying weaknesses. There's no doubt about that. That Russia is weak, and that given enough pressure, it will eventually just fold in on itself. That's very much the NATO hope, and a lot of what we see along the Russian border, whether it's in the Ukraine or whether it's through these massive NATO exercises that regularly take place in the most sensitive areas of Russian national interest, whether it's the Black Sea or near Crimea or along the border with Ukraine or whatever. These are all, in my humble reading, these are all humble provocations, very, very dangerous, incredibly dangerous provocations. But they are theatrical. They're not intended to lead to war. They possibly could lead to war by accident. That's my worry. But they're not actually intended to lead to war. They're intended to put increasing pressure on what Russia sees to be this rather weak political regime, and the West will read the results of its own activity and be overly influenced by it. So many elements of the intelligentsia in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, they like the idea of being modern. They like the idea of being global. They like the idea of being seen to be people you can talk to. They're still totally misled by the real nature of U.S. capitalism, and still yearn for a similar kind of framework for Russia. But it doesn't matter how many of them there are. They're still a very small fraction of the entire 150 million Russians, most of whom are fiercely nationalist. They're fiercely religious, many of them in favor of the Russian Orthodox Church. They're steeped in traditions that are not so much anti-Western, but simply non-Western. And they have a language where the West finds, most Westerners find barely penetrable, even with the most assiduous attempt to learn it. In other words, the intelligentsia, the upper middle class, it doesn't matter what they think, because politically, whatever their preferences are, they count for zilch. And Vladimir Putin stands for a much broader group of Russians than the intelligentsia. In that particular respect, NATO, I think, and the United States is totally deluded in this fantasy that we put enough pressure, if we make things difficult enough, if the NED is in there pumping money in this group or this other group, or we're trying to foment discord in this or that part of the former Soviet Union, eventually we're going to win this game. And then what? Well, then I suppose US corporations can just walk into Russia and do what they want, get what they want, control, just behave as though they were in their own backyard. But they won't, of course, because China will still be there, even if this fantasy came about. In the meantime, the United States and NATO has created a far greater obstacle than it ever had in the past, namely a more and more solid relationship between Russia and China. They both realize that the United States now, you cannot, there's no scenario in which it would make sense for Russian or Chinese leaders to trust anything that the United States has to say on the international stage.
The reason why I was curious, moving back a little bit, the reason why I was curious for you to mention that there was American meddling in the revolution there in the Ukraine, was because the image that I had, and this might be a completely incorrect image, was that there was a revolution that occurred and Russia took advantage of this distraction to move their little green men into Crimea. And so I had this picture of Russia being the aggressor. Is this a useful image in your view?
Well, yes, this is how propaganda works. So an intelligent guy like you, and of course you're in very, very good company, because where else are you going to go? You're taking you're basing your worldview on what you quite fairly regard as intelligent mainstream media, like the New York Times, perhaps, or the London Guardian, or El País, or any of these newspapers, and you think, okay, these are sensible guys. They've got their finger on what's going on, and they obviously regard Russia as the aggressor in Ukraine. But this is how propaganda works. I can spend a little bit of time now sharing with you my interpretation, and I have written about this in my book, Western Mainstream Media and the.
This was your 2017 book?
Yes, no, it's called Western Mainstream Media and the Ukraine Crisis, and I think you're right. I think it's 2017. So, first off, Yanukovych, who is the president of Ukraine, he's the guy he's the loser in this coup. He is a duly elected leader of Ukraine. He is the result of the operation of democracy in the Ukraine. You and I might not like that. We might think he's a terrible fellow. How dare the Ukrainians elect him? But they did. They could have elected someone else, but no, they elected Yanukovych, the so-called pro-Russian president of Ukraine. And then about a year before Yanukovych was due to stand in the next election. So it's a democratic system. Leaders come and go. You don't like this leader. Okay, you wait for the next election, and then you toss him out. That's how we're supposed to do it in the West. But no, we have some riots in Kiev. The riots seem to have some very charming young people in them. They have some very reassuringly middle class people in them. What are they upset about? It appears that they don't like the fact that Yanukovych, having been quite enthusiastic for quite some time about the possibility of moving closer to the European Union and to NATO, quite suddenly, it seems, at the last moment, he changes his mind and he decides that the Russians have actually offered him a better deal. Which is true, by the way. The Russians offered him a far better deal that had very few strings attached, because the whole European thing had a lot of strings attached.
Could you give some examples? This is to do with production of food and this sort of thing, right? I don't remember the story. It's too many years ago.
I know. But the main, I think actually, Shane, the main thing to bear in mind is, okay, so you have a few thousand people protesting Yanukovych. Amidst those few thousand people, you have some very right-wing organizations. They're actually Nazis. They are Nazi organizations, and they appear to be taking control of the situation. They are exploiting popular unrest to further their own political goals, and through the use of force. Both sides use force. So it's a very messy and it's a very bloody process. But what you have to bear in mind is it's just a few thousand people. I don't care whether it's 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000. It is not the entire population of Ukraine, which are many, many millions. They are not in Kiev. And many of them live in the what are called they are called pro-Russian because the parts of Ukraine, half of the country essentially is physically close to Russia. It is Russian speaking. Its culture is far more Russian than Ukrainian. They're certainly not protesting. And in the West, in the rest of Ukraine, you've got a bit of a mixture. And so this is not a democratic process. It is a coup d'etat. Through force, Yanukovych is forced to flee Ukraine, and his party is totally disregarded by the incoming coup regime. It is not allowed to field candidates, the party of the regions. In Crimea, which is far more Russophile than any other part of the Ukraine, not least because of the presence in Crimea of Sebastopol, which is one of the most important Russian naval ports. It has a total legitimate right to Sebastopol. It has a totally legitimate right to station 25,000 Russian troops in Crimea as a result of an internationally brokered treaty from 1 decade or 2 decades from the time of the transition from the Soviet Union to Russia. Russia doesn't need to invade Crimea because it's already got 25,000 troops in Crimea. Mm-hmm. But does Russia simply annex Crimea? Because after all, you've got a very pro-Russian population. There are some anti-Russian populations as well in Crimea. I don't want to simplify this narrative. You've got the Tatar population, which are Muslim.
Heavily anti-Russian.
Very anti-Russian for historical reasons, but they are not the majority. The majority is Russophile, and but Russia doesn't just annex Crimea. The existing parliament in the regional parliament votes to find out whether the Crimean politicians want to be part of the new Ukraine. The new coup government of in Kiev, which is saying things like, let's abolish the Russian language, let's make it not possible for people to speak Russian anymore in public. In other words, let's do everything we possibly can to really annoy anyone who is mildly pro-Russian. Well, yeah, the pro-Russian Crimeans are not going to sit idly by and just roll over. Because they resolutely, time after time after time in recent history, they have expressed their preference for Russia. They've never wanted to be part of the Ukraine. We can get into that story, but it was not the will of the Crimean people ever to be part of Ukraine. That was foisted on them through a succession of rather unfortunate circumstances. And now they're saying, oh my God, this is it. We've had enough. This is an anti-Russian coup in Kiev that does not represent our interests. Let us hold a let us hold a referendum to see whether the people will support a formal request to Russia for Russia to annex us. And that's exactly what happens. There's a referendum. The pro-Russians easily win that election. In very credible opinion polls that took place then and have taken place on a regular basis since then, the Crimean people as a whole have firmly endorsed that decision to leave Ukraine and to be part of Russia. That's the Crimean story.
Yeah, and the presence of the little green men who arrived prior to.
Well, they were already there, and of course, let us not overlook the deeply. What do we call it? Do we call it racist? What do we call it? This expression, "little green men." It's pathetic, isn't it? It's a denigration of someone else's nation and their troops and their right to national security, their right to feel secure. That's what that expression does. It's a propaganda slogan, little green men. So I don't want to use that slogan, but yes.
Well, I didn't mean any.
No,
insult,
I know you did. But this is how this is how propaganda works. It works through these slogans, which become symbols for complex ideologies which are barely understood by the people who use them, but in order to pursue a particular argument. Sorry, go ahead, Justine.
So could you explain? What are they known as from the Russian side, and who were they?
They're bona fide Russian forces. These are bona fide Russian armed forces who are already stationed in Crimea because of the legal entitlement of Russia to Sevastopol, which is one of its major naval ports. So it's a military installation, in other words, and has been for ever since the beginning of the Soviet Union. I would say. So no, the Russians are there because they're already there. And
so sorry, I keep interrupting you, but so one of the aspects that I don't understand is the lack of insignia. So prior to the election,
okay. Yeah. All right. I think at this point, I think I would say I don't have an answer for you. Is it true that there were people without insignia? Perhaps it is. I'm not sure, but it may be true. And then, if it is true, how might I explain it? I could speculate, but at this moment, I don't think I have a ready answer for why that might have been, why that might have happened.
There's another question that I was hoping to ask you about, which is there's an issue in the Crimean crisis that has always confused me, and it's something that's sort of stuck at the back of my mind, and it has to do with this convoy of aid trucks through Ukraine, so through the Donbass region, and I'm not sure exactly where they ended up, but so the image that I got was that this was a distraction. This is something that was done to, I could be completely wrong, that was there was news that these trucks were completely empty or carrying very little, and I was under the impression, rightly or wrongly, that this was a distraction technique that was employed by Russia to have everyone, looking in this direction at the trucks and not looking over here at what forces in Crimea or in the Donbass were doing. What's your impression of what happened?
So please bear in mind that the broader context. Ukraine is a divided nation. It's a nation that's deeply divided between a Russophile population, which may constitute up towards 40-45% of the entire population, and a much more pro-Western population, some parts of which have always been very partial to Nazi or semi-Nazi organizations that leads back to a very complex history back before World War II and during. It's a horrible history, actually. There's a very, very good documentary that Oliver Stone, the celebrated American film director Oliver Stone, did a brilliant documentary that visually relates some of that history. So the broad context, therefore, for Eastern Ukraine, particularly these two republics that are now self-declared republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, very short, for the same reasons that the people of Crimea voted to be annexed to Russia. The peoples in Donetsk and Luhansk, they voted to become republics. They do, however. The history of the Donbass is very different to the history of Crimea. Crimea, it makes absolutely good sense to belong to Russia in the light of its history and in the light of the preferences of the people who live there. But this has never been the case. There is a certain affiliation between many people of the Donbass and Russia, but they don't want to be part of Russia. They never indicated. There may be some people there who would be happier under Russian control, but in my reading is the majority do not. Even of the Russophiles, the majority do not. What they want, and what the Minsk agreements, which were signed by the European Union, by Russia, by the Ukraine back in 2015, and then there was a separate round of negotiations sometime later. What the people of the Donbass want and what the Minsk agreements agreed to was that Kiev needs to give greater autonomy to the different regions, of Ukraine. And that it needs to take the necessary steps for the necessary elections to take place in order for this process to begin. Ukraine has never honored that deal. Ukraine claims that, well, no, we can't because the border between the Donbass and Russia, it hasn't been closed off. Well, that wasn't part of the deal that the Russian border be closed up. The deal was that when Kiev gives greater autonomy within Ukraine, Donbass is not talking about being separate from Ukraine. It's saying we want more autonomy, just like, I guess the parallel might be Catalonia or.
Where do you see that conflict going in the future? Do you have an eye on this still, and do you have some sort of feeling as to whether there's going to be more unity or whether these are going to remain independent?
I'm not terribly good at telling the future. I'm not going to make any claims to great wisdom in this respect. But as I'm looking at the current situation, what you remember that we got this gentleman who was a television clown, Zelensky, who's the current president of the coup president. What was his name? Begins with a P. I've lost it for the moment. He was the coup president. or rather the guy who was elected president in the first presidential elections following the coup, Poroshenski, and he became deeply unpopular. I think he actually wanted to begin to respect and to execute the Minsk agreements, but he couldn't. Why? Because every time he indicated he was going in that direction, these Nazi, very powerful, right-wing, militarized Nazi organizations that have now been integrated into the Ukrainian armed forces. They threaten mayhem. They don't represent the majority of the Ukrainian, but they have power. And they have military power, they have force, and they have an ideology that will stop at nothing. And so against that kind of pressure, that kind of threat, most people apparently cave in. And so that's why, the main reason why the Minsk agreements had never taken place. And so the previous guy then increasingly lost. He was just as corrupt as all the other previous presidents. So if anything, Ukrainian discontent with the corruption of their own system has increased since the coup of 2014. Is now more intense and more upset, more disturbed today than it was even back in 2014. And so this gentleman, he's a comedian. He's a television comedian, Zelensky. And he had a show, a comedy show, about a Ukrainian president. And so in the run-up to his election, this show is still going on. And in the show, he mouths all kinds of sentiment that many Ukrainians would listen to and would be reassured by. Sentiments against anti-corruption, sentiments against the war, and this, that, and the other. And without ever actually having an explicit policy, all he's got are what people believe he stands for because of his comedy show on television. He gets into power, and it turns out, of course, he's as neoliberal as they come. He's got less and less popular. He's now he came in with a very strong percentage of the vote, and now it's down to, I don't know, 20, 25%, that kind of thing. And now, so this clown, I will call him a clown because A, he is a professional clown, and B, as a politician, he continues to behave like a clown. So Zelensky has badgered. He was badgering the Trump administration and NATO. Oh, please, please help Ukraine, poor little old Ukraine, beat back the evil Russians and the influence they are unduly exerting on our poor, pathetically underrepresented people in Donbass. Total nonsense, of course. And then Trump and at the beginning, the Biden administration seemed to be kind of warming up to this narrative. Oh, wow. Yeah, he's saying just the kind of things that we like Ukrainian presidents to say. He's talking about how evil the Russians are, what a threat Russians are to national security. This is the kind of stuff that we supported the 2014 coup for, but through the services of Victoria Nuland at that time, who boasted about how the United States had invested $5 billion, mainly through the National Endowment for Democracy, to bring about regime change in Ukraine. So you would have thought that these kind of cries for help from Zelensky, from this deeply unpopular president, clown President Zelensky, would move NATO and the United States to immediately say, yes, 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 let's have a war. And let's tell you what, Zelensky, let's have a war on your territory, since that's what you seem to be suggesting. And it doesn't matter. They've got nukes, we've got nukes. Let it just roll, man. Well, thank God. We got very, very close to the precipice just about a month ago. But since then, the noises have abated somewhat. And I think some cooler heads have now taken control. I read just recently, but yeah, I would like to see this confirmed by the new Secretary of State Blinken, Biden's man. He made a visit about a month ago to Ukraine, and people worried that he was there to to spice up
To saber rattle.
the thirst for war, the thirst for blood. But now it's being said that no, actually, the real reason he went out there was to say, cool the rhetoric down, cool it down. And there's a very good reason, because any war that's going to be fought in Ukraine is going to be won by Russia. I said I wasn't going to tell. I said I wasn't going to forecast the future, but
Tell the future.
I think
Yeah.
that's the conclusion of most sensible people, and because Russia's got all the equipment it needs, it's got geographical proximity, it's got a population that supports it in the Donbass, and it's got very advanced nuclear weapons, including hypersonic nuclear weapons that the United States only a few weeks ago only first began to test. The Russians have got it. It's all tested. They've got them. Russia will win in any time in the foreseeable to medium-term future. Russia will win that war. But Putin is way more astute than his critics give him. He could invade Ukraine. Actually, he could probably take over the entirety of Ukraine without there being a truly meaningful Western response. But he doesn't do that because he's an intelligent man, and he doesn't want to create more problems than he needs, or that Russia wants, or that anyone actually wants. He's relatively, in that respect, humane. But whether or not he's humane, he's definitely intelligent. He's definitely smarter, and I would say he's a great deal smarter than his equivalents in both Russia and both the United States and in most other NATO countries.
So I want to jump back into speaking directly about media propaganda. And so this all started. This stream of conversation started when I wanted to ask about some of the techniques that are being used now. So speaking about Russian intelligence, there's this idea that there are these bot armies and troll farms. So the idea is that they're spreading misinformation and disinformation. So I wanted to ask, first of all, what is the definition of misinformation as opposed to disinformation, and how are they used by these groups, if these groups indeed exist?
Well, disinformation, like propaganda, it's a yes, of course, it's telling lies, isn't it? But it's telling lies in sophisticated ways that they seem as though they could be true. Because most propaganda, and for that matter, most disinformation, usually contains elements of truth. In fact, the best propaganda and the best disinformation is all true, because then it can't be proven to be false, but it's not the whole truth. You present facts A, B, C, and D, but you neglect to mention anything about facts E, F, G, and H, because if your audience knew about E, F, G, and H, they would reassess and re-evaluate what it means to say A, B, C, and D. That's what the good propagandist does. Now, I'm going to quickly jump to the first part of the question that you just put to me, because I'm thinking this whole thing about bots and trolls and all of that, and deep fakes and this, that, and the other. It's all kind of interesting, but lately I'm coming to the conclusion it's all a distraction. There's a small reason for that, and then a much bigger reason. But the small reason that I say that is because, well, actually, if I look at the American media scene right now. And I asked myself, well, who are the most likely sources of disinformation that have such a power and such an authority that they could actually swing an election? I'm not going to look at bots and trolls, and I'm not going to look at organizations like the Internet Research Agency. And by the way, I certainly wouldn't assess the effectiveness of a disinformation campaign by selecting very selectively one potential source of disinformation and totally disregard hundreds of others internationally, also state-run organizations around the world. They would include Israel. They would include South Africa. They would include any of 100 or more countries that have an interest in the outcome of American elections. They're all at it. And any propaganda that tries to persuade you that only the Russians are uniquely capable of coming up with the idea, oh, we might be able to influence people by sending out some disinformation on the internet, without mentioning all of the other people who are engaged in this kind of game, including Cambridge Analytica and its parent, which of course is now defunct, and its parent SCL, which knowingly interfered in the elections of over 100 countries in favor of the foreign policy interests of the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So the selectivity that is going on in this conversation, not in our conversation, but in this conversation about election meddling, is itself a deeply disturbing aspect of the entire narrative. But I wouldn't bother with the bots, and I would look at things like Fox News. I would look at things like MSNBC. I would look at things like the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times. I would look at the stories that they're telling and what people are likely to conclude as a result of interpreting the world through the eyes of these very, very well-resourced media conglomerates, because all of them are component parts of much, much bigger business empires.
I guess this was the question I was curious about. I was wondering if these new techniques for media control and propaganda, I was wondering whether they allowed new actors to come into the game and whether there was some sort of democratization of media propaganda. Originally I was thinking that maybe if bot farms are a thing, that maybe you needed to be a state or a large actor to employ a large enough army or enough trolls to influence, sway public opinion. But do you have a gauge there?
Yes. I mean, the term democratization is a little bit disturbing in this particular context. Democratization of telling lies. But I think you have a point. You've got more than a point. We are living in a new age. And we are living in an age where it's demonstrably the case that most of us have access to a far, far broader range of voices, of different voices than we had in the era before social media came along. So that, I think, is demonstrably the case. Do non-state actors make use of this? I would say absolutely yes. All the big corporations, all the I need to be careful, not all, but a good many of the big corporations, a good many of plutocrats. I'm thinking of once again, the Koch brothers, the way in which they have used social media and mainstream media in all kinds of ways to advance their pro-fossil fuel agenda in the last decade or so. But yes, are there some non-conservative groups that may also be engaged? Of course there are. So, and I frankly, if you're asking me, well, what is the respective weight that we need to give to each of these segments within the social media universe? I don't know, really. I mean, there must be indicators that mathematicians will use, quite rightly, or statisticians will use, and then they would likely have the number of people who view, the number of messages that actually pass by the machine of any particular viewer. What are the chances that of all the million social media messages? What are the chances that I personally, Oliver Boyd-Barrett, here in California, what are the chances that I personally will see any one of them? I think the answer is remote. There's a very remote chance, unless uh, um, those those messages are coming from sources that are already powerful, probably sources that are already linked to the established mainstream media. The same old gang that have always controlled our information space are still there. If we're talking about international news, it's in terms of the people who actually generate original international news, it's still the same old gang. It's still Reuters. It's still Associated Press. It's still Agence France Presse. It's still the BBC. It's still the CNN. There's nothing, no number of no number of bots removes from the authority and the power that these guys wield. So that's my conclusion on that. But Shane, I do want to move to a broader issue that I think is more important.
Absolutely.
Because you
Absolutely.
basically on this issue of well, how is propaganda done? Is it bots and trolls that we need to talk about, and we're trying to understand where propaganda is going? I think not really. I actually don't think the mechanics of propaganda have changed all that much since since the days of Edward Bernays. And if you want to talk about Edward Bernays, let's do so somewhat.
So what date is that?
Okay, so
Can you attach a date there?
Edward Bernays is some people regard him as the granddaddy of public relations. He has actually been good enough to tell us, and it's on film. He's been good enough to tell us that the term public relations, he and some of his buddies in the early 1920s came up with the term public relations because they realized that people no longer trusted the word propaganda anymore. They'd seen how propaganda, they had seen what propaganda is and what it does during World War I, and they don't like it, and they don't want propaganda. So let's come up with something new that describes what it is that people like Edward Bernays and his mates did back then. Why don't we call it public relations? That's it. But we need to come. Edward Bernays is actually very important in any conversation about propaganda and how it's done. But I don't want to talk about him right now. What I want to do, what I want to invite you to do, and your listeners, is an Einsteinian imaginative experiment. Let's imagine, Shane, that you and I are employed, let's say by the CIA, but it could be any of the multiple intelligence agencies. We have access to, well, pretty much unlimited funds, Shane. And even the amount of money that they give us, even that doesn't represent the real money that's there, because the real money, they can produce it out of nowhere whenever they need for us. So the last thing we ever have to worry about, Shane, is money. And we also know that the most important part of international relations and the management of international conflict is the management of perception. Because that's what our predecessors had discovered. That's what they had learned from their granddaddies, and that's what their granddaddies had learned from their granddaddies, is all to do with the management of perception. What changes perception? Two things. One, information or misinformation, and two, the emotions that you can evoke through the manipulation of information and misinformation.
Which today seems to be the more important of the two. I mean, America's super divided. The West in general is quite divided and emotional.
But I kind of need, forgive me, Shane, I will come back to that, but I kind of need to just finish this bit of the narrative. We're doing this imaginative experiment, and we're asking ourselves, so what is it that we now know after these generations of playing this game? What is it that we now know about propaganda that works? Well, we know that it really evokes some emotions that are going to work in our favor. Maybe these are emotions of fear. Maybe these are emotions of hate, of disgust for a disgusting enemy. So that's one of the things we know. Another thing that we know is people are so easily confused. They hear something from person A, and then there's this person B over here, and he's saying something different. Gee, this is confusing. We can't handle this. The brain sort of freeze like the wood on a malfunctioning computer screen. So the one thing we know about propaganda is we need lots of people to be saying the same thing. Oh, well, what kind of people? Well, the kind of people that people trust, like important politicians or respected business people or people who we admire, celebrities and sports people and people like
authority figures.
So now we're getting a sense, and this is Bernays understood this very well. Even back in the 1920s. These are some of the ingredients of successful propaganda that your average person, when they look out into their information universe, all they see is the same thing, the same message, but from different people, sometimes using different information, but all the information is cohering very neatly and harmoniously together in one harmonious story. Okay, now we understand how some of the ingredients of how propaganda works. So we have unlimited funds. We also, because we are CIA, we have unlimited influence. We can go to whoever we want. We can persuade them because we're so likable, we're so affable, or we can just flatten them. We can tell them, like John Bolton told the first managing director of the OPCW, we know where your family are. We understand you have a son in New York. We know where he lives. Bolton said that. You got all the tools you need, bribery and threat and money. You have everything you need to create the situation that you want people, or the information that you want people to hear. Now, you also know, because of your study as propaganda has told you this, that effective propaganda can also be illustrated with reference to a real world. So what happens if in the real world there's nothing that supports the information that you want to sell? Oh, well, we got unlimited funds. We create the reality that we need, so that the information that we disseminate relates back to the reality that we fabricated. Now, we found most of this stuff out by accident, by trial and error, but now we know for sure how it works. So now we start with this model. We want people to really, really dislike China right now. Yeah, it'd be a really, really good idea to have a nuclear war with China before they buy any more nuclear weapons. And maybe the population can't stomach the idea of usual, normal nukes. So we'll make small nukes that seem a little bit less threatening and a little bit more. Whatever it takes, we need to defeat this competitor to U.S. interest in Asia. Now, what are the kind of things that really get people upset? Because most people are good. Most people want to be good. They want to be seen to be good people. And most people are upset when they see egregious injustice. People being, well, we could refer, of course, to the murder of 60 children in Palestine, couldn't we? But we won't talk about them, because that's not the propaganda message that we want our Western audiences to focus on right now. Pity about the 60 kids, but that's not terribly helpful. No. What's much, much more helpful to our case is we want people to believe that the Chinese, just because they're evil, innately evil, they've gone out to one of their westernmost provinces, Xinjiang, and they've set up concentration camps, and they're just horning the Uyghur people. They're just horning them by the thousands and putting them in these concentration camps and doing terrible things.
So this is not happening?
Well, or let's put aside the question, but doesn't it make some sense to you that but we have to presume, to start with, Shane, that because you and I are pretty senior members of the CIA, we're kind of amoral. So we have to kind of presume our basic amorality, or at least we have entrusted our morality to the state. We have entrusted our sense of morality to some higher power, and it sure as hell isn't God. So it's probably whatever interests lie behind the US system of democracy. And we have the resources. We know that we have to have everyone speaking on the same page. And above all, we've also learned this because we learned this in Syria. The British learned it for us. It's a really good idea to have funded hundreds of different humanitarian organizations that are totally dependent on our funding to go out and get the information that we need, so that when we need to prove that humanitarian abuses have taken place by people that we don't like, abuses by people such as, let's imagine, Bashar Assad in Syria. We don't like him. You want to tell me that there are some abuses going up in Egypt under General Sisi, whom we levered into power a few years ago? No. Not talking about Sisi now. Are we talking about Saudi Arabia? Are we talking about the guy who murdered a journalist in cold blood and in a Saudi embassy? No. We're only talking about the evil that someone evil like Bashar Assad could do. Do we have the evidence? Well, we could have the evidence if we have these humanitarian organizations who we are paying to go out into the field. If they can't find the documentation, let them make it up. If they can't find the photos, like the Caesars photos, well, they can find the photos. It's just that it gets a little bit fuzzy when we are challenged to prove that the photos are actually the photos of dead and tortured people who died in Bashar Assad's Syrian jail. So we've learned how to do this trick. We've learned how to pay off. Hundreds was an exaggeration, but dozens is getting closer to the reality. Dozens of so-called non-government organizations, which are almost totally funded by governments, and in particular, in this instance, by the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. We paid them, and we want to find victims of chemical weapons assaults. We'll pay these guys to find the witnesses. And then they can bring their witnesses to a nice, respectable, clean UN-governed organization like the OPCW, and the entire world will just lick it all up.
Escaped Sapiens.